Hey guys, back with another video. How do we paint a vibrant, shimmering water surface like this? And how do we determine the color palette for the entire piece? Let's dive right in and take a look. First, let's start by laying down a relatively simple sketch. Next, we'll split the water surface into hot wool layers to block in the base colors. One for the darks and one for the lights. For the dark tones, make sure the saturation is high. For the light tones, both the brightness and saturation need to be up. Once that's set, we'll use the polygonal lasso tool to map out shape of the bird's body. When selecting this area, do it into steps. First, the white section of the body, and second, the red section of its legs. Since we'll be rendering the legs separately later on, I'm isolating them as their own selection areas first. After this is done, it's time to start refining the dark areas of the water surface. We will stick to a layered approach. Start with the base color and build the dark values right on top of it. Then, on top of those dark values, we deepen them with even darker tones. The shadow areas aren't just a single flat dark tone. Notice that our initial base color leans a bit grayish. And since it's a desaturated base, naturally, there will be deeper, darker, and more intense levels of shadow emerging. We want to push the darks down layer by layer. By doing this, we can accurately define the exact placement and color values for each layer of shadow, step by step. While working on this, keep in mind that the water surface can look a bit chaotic and busy. So as you paint, try to utilize distinct brush strokes to establish a nice contrast between large and small shapes. Makes sense. Now, going back to the foreground water, you can see I've already dye blocked in a good chunk of the colors. So, what's the underlying artistic principle behind blocking into specific areas? Let's first analyze the contrast of focus and clarity across the entire water surface. The colors in the background are generally deeper and leaning more heavily towards a cooler green. Meanwhile, the foreground colors are noticeably warmer, yellower, and slightly lighter in value. However, the foreground features a much higher contrast between edge lights and deep shadows. To sum it up, high contrast in the front, low contrast in the back. This is exactly how we establish a sense of atmospheric perspective and depth right off the bat. Once that's established, we also need to remember that the ripples on the water surface follows clear perspective lines. Think of the water ripples as concentric circles, but these circles are skewed by perspective into ellipses. If you mess up the perspective of these circular shapes, the camera angle of your entire illustration will fall apart. That's why I'm adding plenty of dark tones and textures here, making so every stroke aligns perfectly with the elliptical curves of the original reference. This keeps the perspective structurally sound. Another tip, don't obsess over those fine highlight streaks or dark stripes early on. Just trust the layering workflow, first the base layer, then the primarish shadow layer, followed by a darker tone, and then an even deeper tone. In short, just work your way down the value hierarchy. Identify which areas require deeper values, and gradually block them in to feel out the composition. Take the foreground area as an example. I started with a simple flat base color. Once the base color was down, I layered the shadows on top. After that, I introduced even darker values, because the darks through the pieces vary in intensity from spot to spot. A single layer of shadow obviously won't capture the full depth needed for all the dark sections. That's why I need to build it up progressively, adding value layers by layer. The exact same logic applies to the water surface in the background. I'll start by mapping out a softer shadow, and then, based on what the piece needs, I'll carve out the deepest nooks with an even heavier tone. During this stage, solely focus on pushing your darks. Don't worry about where the highlights are. And don't worry about how to render those lighter ripple lines yet. Let them are until your dark values have enough depth. We'll come back later to bring out and sculpt the lighter values all at once. This workflow ensures our overall value relationships stay completely accurate. First, establish the soft and sharp contrasts of the entire water surface. Then, block in the large color shapes. Once those big color blocks are relic down, we can easily introduce the lighter values on separate layers. Doesn't that make the whole process so much simpler? Now that the overall major forms are established, we can shrink our brush size and start detailing from the background to the foreground. Even though my strokes might look a bit scattered and loose here, the core methodology remains exactly the same. The shadow layers here still feel a bit lacking in depth, so I'm touching them up a little more. Once that's fixed, we can start carving out the lighter tones directly within the shadow shapes. When bringing out these lighter values, there's one crucial thing to keep in mind. Since the light tones in the back are part of the background, their value F contrast won't be nearly as intense as the ones in the foreground. So, even with light and shadow interplaying in the background, the overall contrast must remain relatively muted. The foreground, on the other hand, demands punchy contrast. Notice how I pop the foreground highlights to make them significantly brighter. Why? Because of atmospheric perspective clear in the front, hazy in the back, high contrast up close, low contrast far away. Once you've nailed down the macro environment, the rest is just a simply matter of balancing your dark and light details. You can go right ahead and brush in the lighter tones now, since our base values are already structurally sound. However, as I'm pulling out the lights, I'm also weaving in some deep darks to account for the ambient occlusion AO shadows. You cannot skip these occlusion shadows. If you don't anchor them down, your beautiful highlights won't pop at all. So, once the foundation is solid, the rest of the process is simply matching the values of your reference. Look closely at the reference contrast to darken those sharp AO cavities, or conversely, pull out the crispiest highlights. At this stage, try to keep your brush strokes as stylized and pieces clean as possible. Granted, my background isn't super simplified because I plan to apply a Gaussian blur later. This will help create a stronger sense of depth or spatial contrast. That's why I actually rendered more details in the back first after the Gaussian blur. It'll retain both the blurriness and the rich textures, see? Once we're at this point, all that's left are these small highlights on the right side, right? When we pick colors to bring out these highlights, keep in mind that we are still using a layering technique or layered approach. It's the same logic. Layer lighter values over darks, and then add even brighter tones on top of those. Initially, our main focus was blocking out the midtones to dark values. Now, we need to work on transitioning from midtones to highlights, right? Alright, now that the background is sorted out, we can start working on the foreground. The same principle applies here. If the dark values in the foreground aren't deep enough, we push them further, right? Take these ripples in the front, for instance, they must follow the perspective lines of the scene. These ripples are shaped by the horizon line and camera angle, so you have to keep perspective in mind as they spread from the center outward, making them deeper and more pronounced. Now, you might notice that the water in the reference photo isn't actually this dark. So why am I pushing the dark so hard? It's that same layering workflow. We start with a base color, build up the dark values step by step, and once the darks are established, we can gradually pop the lighter reflections on top, right? Once you have enough dark values, it's time for the highlights, so make sure your dark tones have enough depth first, before worrying about how to layer the lighter ones. Now we're moving on to the brights. Let's think about the atmospheric pursuit or edges here. We want high contrast in the foreground and soft contrast in the background. Therefore, the value contrast between the darks and lights in the front needs to be much punchier. Just build it up layer by layer like this. For the reflections in the bottom left corner, they look a bit messy. If it's chaotic, just make sure the contrast is clean and blocked in thorough shapes based on the reference. That's plenty. We need to keep pushing the highlights in the back, and if the darks are lacking, we keep deepening them. Once the water ripples start coming together, you might think, wait, why does it still look a bit off from the reference? That's because we need to introduce some warm ambient light. To do this, I'm using a blending mode overlay to paint in some warm light over the areas. Next, let's flesh out the details. Go back to the base layer, add some shattered lines and scattered points extending outwards, and picking a bright highlight color to dot on top. We can also add some secondary details on the water surface. Basically, to get that shimmering, glittering water effect, you need these bright reflections. Sharp highlights and textures alongside the main ripples. Let's add plenty of them. If it still lacks punch after detailing, you can use an airbrush to add a subtle glow on top. But be careful if you overuse the airbrush, the whole piece will look muddy or chalky. After that, we need to balance the edges lost and found edges for all these rich brush strokes, highlights, and speckles. Sharp focus in the front, soft focus in the back. The background needs to blurred out. I also added a rim light or outline to the whole thing. This rim light really elevates the overall mood and makes the piece looks more cohesive. Just make sure the color of the linear or rim matches the color palette of the scene. Let's change the outline to a warm green to give it more color variety. Now, let's jump back to the bird. First, let's do a cell shading to value block in. The overall tone is on the warmer, reddish side. Once the shadow shapes are blocked in, we can break down its form into planes. For this bird, we can divide it into the bottom, side, and top planes to give it a 3D, box-like form, creating a clear structure of highlights, midtones, and shadows. Once the highlights, midtones, and shadow planes are established, we can pick a color for the reflected light. By this point, the basic volume of the bird is pretty much set. Next, the real challenge is color grading. Since it's immersed in this specific environment, color harmony, how to make its local reds blend naturally with the surroundings. That means you need to incorporate more ambient light interaction. You have to think about how the color of the water bounces reflected light into the bird's shadow areas. That's why I hit a lot of cool tones in the shadows first, as these cool colors represent the skylight or sky reflection. As we get closer to the bird's underbelly or the lower part of its body, I'll introduce more greens. After all, the warm green water surface is going to cast a bounce light up into the bird's shadows. Plus, since the bird's feathers are relatively light or whitish, the reflected light will show up quite strongly. Alright, with that done, let's render the bird's legs. The legs have pretty high saturation and show a bit of subsurface escading or translucency. Translucency means vibrant saturation. So don't overlook this detail, otherwise, the whole effect will fall flat. At the same time, the bird casts a reflection onto the water surface, so can't forget to paint this reddish reflection either. Alright, hitting this stage means our speed painting or illustration is basically completed. Finally, let's take a look at the finished piece.